Hello, crew. I know there are some folks in the chat already, and Rourke, I know that you are on your way, which is wonderful. We're going to do the typical hangout for 5 minutes or so for folks to get here. I'm going to tweet out about what's happening, and I just want to check and make sure y'all can hear me. Hi, Anarin. Is that how you... I have been practicing. Anarin is how you say your name? Just to make sure I'm not fucking it up. Hi, Rourke. Boop, boop, boop. Oh, it would be easier if I did this. Ooh, yay! I'm sorry I didn't get it 100% right. I do my best, but sometimes one's best is not enough. And Aaron, okay. And Aaron, okay. I will hopefully not fuck that up again. What am I trying to say? Oh. You're valid, Aaron. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, da, da. No worries, Rourke. We're just doing the hangout that normally I do, so that folks have some time to get here. Beep, boop, 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 boop. Oh, I'm so glad. At 5 we can do it, or not 5. Wow, Jesus, that is at maybe 5 Rourke's time. At 4:05, we could do a pronoun check too. I think I know everybody's, but just so we're clear on what other folks' pronouns are. Because that's just fun. And also, this is a place I would love to say, and love to be able to say, is one where folks can try out new pronouns if that's something they're interested in doing, where it can just happen in this space. You don't have to go out and do anything else with those pronouns if you just want to test them out here. That's my life policy, is you should always be able to play around. So, hi, Kiefling! Nice, yes. It's delightful. So, I always never know what to do with this early stretch time, even though I insist on making it happen. It's like when I show up 10 minutes early for my class and my students are there, and you just sit in silence and look at your phone for the 10 minutes, and you're like, well, don't know what to do about that. Thanks, Anarin. It's, I got this at, I don't know if you have Target over there. It's an American company that sells a lot of junk, but they have in big cities a Pride section every year, because corporate Pride is a party. And this is from last year's corporate Pride. They are queer popsicles, so there's a bunch of different rainbow ones, and then there are ones like these that are rainbows. So, I like this shirt a lot. It's a good shirt. Yeah. This year their shirts there's one button up that has gay pride flags on it that I bought, and it's cute, but all the other it wasn't as cute as this, and there was a Love is Love one, which I think is stupid personally. You're all here for my opinions that's advertised in the show, but I think that the sort of Love is Love thing is overrated, and I'm not interested in it because I don't think it means anything. Not to go all Lee Edelman saying silence equals death doesn't mean anything on y'all. I would never say that. Silence equals death is not. It means stuff. Yeah, exactly, Kiefling. It's I get it, and I get its use if all you care about is marriage, but I have other things that I have to worry about than that, so I do other stuff. But it looks like it's 4:05, so if we want to do, Rourke, I know you already just posted your pronouns. I use Z and here are my pronouns. And I think I know everyone else's, but just, you know, if you want to reiterate them real fast before we are off to the races. They, them, he, him. Awesome. Great. I feel like we have, like, magically we've got one of every kind of pronoun, even though that's not possible, but you have your non-they, them, non-binary, and then they, them, and then she, her, and he, him, which is awesome. Thanks so much for coming out on this Thursday afternoon for me. I know it's other times for folks in other places, but today we're going to talk about the closet. And the closet is one of my favorite things to talk about in queer history, because when I first learned the stuff I'm going to talk to y'all about, which was not really until senior year of college or the year afterwards, the summer after college, I was like blown away. My little brain was like... So, I want to talk about the closet because I think it's really interesting. And I think it opens up a lot of really interesting doors to talk about other stuff later. So, the closet. What is it? All the folks that are speaking out in chat, I think know what the closet is, but I'm going to reiterate it anyway for other folks who are maybe just lurking or who might be watching the VOD, whatever, I don't know. I love to explain things and define my terms. I'm an academic. It's what I'm supposed to do. So, the closet, this is literally like I was looking up on Wikipedia today just to see what it had to say. And it says that the closet is an adjective describing LGBTQ folks. They did not use folks. I'm not directly quoting. What is that called? I can't remember. So it's an adjective describing LGBTQ folks who have not disclosed their sexuality or gender identity. Gender orientation, that works too. And one of the things, interestingly enough, that Wikipedia does not say in that is that it's a sociocultural construction that has a very specific temporal existence. We have not always had the closet, because it didn't used to exist. It was not always used by queer people. It was not always used by straight people. It was used first by queer people, and then we can talk about that transition because I think that's really interesting. But I think this really also opens up a great door to talk about queer history more broadly, because especially in the month of Pride, we're hearing a lot of things about particularly like American narratives of sort of queer rights or queer history. And one of the things that I want to get across today is that queer history is not a monolithic, neat narrative that is progressive. Or you might also have heard it sort of be like a Wiggian narrative, meaning that the actual story of queer history as we understand it, particularly in the 20th century in the US, is not one of like, things were garbage and then they got better. It's way messier than that. Teleological, yeah, thanks, Rourke. It's not teleological. Queer history is, as far as I understand it, and the way that I'm going to talk about it in these streams, is very specific to a number of different registers. It's specific to other identities, including race, gender, your location, what time we're in. Stonewall, for example, all of us are familiar with Stonewall, or the sort of riots or uprisings surrounding the Stonewall Bar, right, in 1969, which happened this month, and I will probably have a whole thing to talk about what I'm talking about here just now, but later. But for folks outside of New York, at the time, Stonewall was not actually that big a deal. It was not a catalyst. I mean, they have done the Queer Twin Cities Oral History Project, which has a book produced out of it. And yeah, a lot was going on in 68, 69. But the people that were interviewed who live in Minnesota, who were living here, I'm in Minnesota, who were living in Minnesota at the time of Stonewall, were like, we didn't hear about it and we didn't care about it. We had our own shit that was happening. And I think that's something that I really want to talk about. And so it's not that important, right? Stonewall, this critical moment, the reason we have gay pride, is not that important in Minnesota. In San Francisco, right, sort of the other epicenter of queer history, if we think about it as being this, like, urban coastal story, San Francisco had already had the Compton riots beforehand, which were, it's a series of riots and protests about discriminatory practices of Gene Compton's cafeteria. We might talk about that if that also interests you. The story that we're telling there's a reason, right, that it is rooted in these certain things, and that it becomes these moments that are sort of like, they tell the story about who we are and our history, but that's not true only. So that's one of the things I'm going to say about today's thing that I'm talking about, is I'm using primarily the sort of critical text about the history of the closet that is not Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, which I have not read and did not want to try to read in 1 week, which is good because I barely read the parts of this that were supposed to. But this is George Chauncey's Gay New York. Chauncey is a gay history scholar. He got his PhD from Yale in 1989, so he's sort of at the second generation-ish of queer history scholars, and the first ones who maybe had some support from the academy. I mean, John D'Amelio got his PhD before then, but writes and talks a lot about how, like, garbagely he was treated and how everything he was doing was dismissed. Chauncey, right, is able to work on this project for his degree at Yale, and well, from what I understand, it was not that supportive, right? He has gone on and has become one of the huge names in queer history. He has taught, so he got his degree from Yale in 89, his PhD. He's taught at the University of Chicago. He went back, he was at Yale again, teaching for a long time, and just this past fall, he's now teaching at Columbia in New York City. So, this book, Gay New York, is kind of a classic. The subtitle, for the record, is Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, 1890 to 1940. And that is going to be important in a second. This is probably the most highly cited text about gay history out there. I would say, if you're going to see a thing thrown out about gay people during this period in any book, they're probably citing this. And that means some things. It might be oversighted in some people's opinions at the expense of books that are just as good or better and were coming out at the same time but were eclipsed by this. I know people who have that opinion. I wanted and tried actually pretty hard to get texts that would address the same questions that aren't this one, because citation is praxis, and what that means is that, you know, me citing a cis white gay man for this means that thing, you know, that it's like one historian's narrative, and I don't love that. but in the time frame I'd given myself, finding other texts was not feasible. The folks that I know that would have options are out of town, blah, blah, blah. I'm hoping later to sort of be able to come back to you and say, here are alternatives to using this text. But that is not a thing that is happening at this time. So, this book, oversighted, but also important. God gave us two hands to understand those things. And there's something else that I want to talk about, Chauncey, that might be a little... I think it's something that gay historians will say to each other, but not publicly. And this is sort of public, but not really. But at the end of this book, Chauncey basically said, I have finished this book in 1940, and I am going to write a book from the post-war period through, I think it's up through Stonewall, where he's basically going to tackle the 40s through the 50s and 60s in New York City. That book has not come out. I don't even know that he's published articles from that book. I haven't looked that hard, but no one else has touched that because this sort of author of this intense work. Yeah, Rourke, not Man-Boy Love. We'll talk about Man-Boy Love all day long. I'll do a damn fucking episode on Man-Boy Love if you want. But this book, he makes a claim that he's going to go out and do some stuff with it, with the sort of next phase of research or the next time period, and he has not, and no one else has touched it because he's laid claim to it, and that means that I'm bitter at all times about this. I mean, he's really busy. He's done a lot of other work. If you, in the U.S., he has provided testimony for a couple of Supreme Court cases, particularly about marriage. He, I think, is one of the major historians who provided testimony on the Prop 8 case in front of the Supreme Court, if you're familiar with that. So he's, like, busy, but also just say you're not going to do it. So, those are my caveats with this book. There are other caveats within this book, which is that, and he admits this part in the book, there's almost nothing about lesbians. He has like one section within a chapter maybe about lesbians, but the sources, the way that it's like that sources happen with histories of gay men and lesbians is they're different because of gender. There's nothing about, it is gay men. He has a pretty good section on gay black men, particularly because he's examining the ball scene in and around New York. But otherwise, any other sort of non-white folks kind of fall out of frame. He pays pretty good attention to class, which is good, so I can recommend it for that perspective in New York. But this book was published in 1994, right? So it's really old in terms of the world of academic publishing. So is a classic in some ways, is very good for talking about the closet, is probably the seminal work for talking about the closet historically, has some issues. God gave us two hands to hold both those things. So, yeah, is that older than you, Rourke? Is that older than some folks in chat? I was alive in 94, although I was a baby. But, the closet. Chauncey talks about the closet in this book where you're all babies, except Keithling. High five, bud. We are older than those folks. The catch-22 about talking about the closet as a sort of ahistorical construct, right, that has always existed, Chauncey says, comes down to these two positions you're forced to take. One of those positions is that you have to either blame people for the fact that they were not coming out in history, or you have to sort of say, and that blame may be like, well, they couldn't, but that, you know, if only they had been brave enough. Oh yeah, Keefling, ball culture is very different. We will talk about ball culture later, probably, almost definitely when I do my multi-part series on drag. But so, blame folks for having, for not being brave enough to come out of the closet, or assume this sort of deeply internalized homophobia. And both of those things also make a third assumption about the closet, which is that the closet means that you keep your identity hidden from straight people, absolutely, from other gay people, and maybe even from yourself. So those sort of three factors are things that I think we're really going to debunk today, because, y'all, you can be out of the closet in some contexts and not others, even today, right? Like, you can be out to your friends and not out to your parents. Are you really out? I'm not the closet police, so I don't know. Come to your own conclusions. But the thing that Chauncey has discovered is the closet as a term was not used by gay people before the 1960s. It just doesn't show up. Yeah, no cops in this chat. If you're a cop, you have to tell me, and then I might ask you to leave. And no mods. And I don't think even automod. One of you can try and write dyke in there, and we'll see what goes on. If it does show up, let me know. So the closet, not used by queer people before the 1960s. Oh, damn. Automod is garbage. Sorry. I'll figure out how to fix that later. So can we just, like, for a hot second picture that world, right? Because we're all in this world where the closet is ever present. It's the way that we think about our identities, right? We are either in the closet or out of the closet, or we're in the closet with some people and out of the closet with other people. That was not true before the 1960s. Folks who talked about it would more likely talk about living a double life or wearing masks at different times. And that concept, right, is radically different from the closet, because the closet in a lot of ways is defined by isolation, right? It's defined by you are the only one and you will not tell anyone. And that's not how it worked, according to the sources, right, that Chauncey is drawing from. I want to read what he has to say here because it strikes me. I have a couple pages marked, but this is one of them. So he says, the fact that gay people in the past did not speak of or conceive of themselves as living in the closet does not preclude us from using the term retrospectively as an analytic category, but it does suggest that we need to use it more cautiously and precisely, and to pay attention to the very different terms people use to describe themselves and their social worlds. So, right, what does it mean? And this is a conversation we can continue to have, and I think should continue to have, but what does it mean to use language that the folks that you're talking about didn't use to talk about themselves? That can be complicated, right? If we're making claims about people being gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender and or transsexual in the past. What does that mean? Where does that leave us? Does it leave us with only same-sex behavior? That's a really complicated tangle that can be really hard to tease out. It's something I'm constantly working on, where I stand in this and what I think about it. And I still don't have an answer, right? I'm in my third year almost of coursework, and I don't have an answer for that question, because I feel the imperative sort of from both sides to be both accurate, but also to claim a history, and this is the constant tension I'm running into. Other people don't have that tension. Other people are happy to go, there have always been gay people. I like specificity. I like context. I think it gets us closer to a truer version of the past is not quite right. But I think using those terms sort of without explaining yourself, or without explaining how you're justifying it, is something that can be very messy very quickly. I had a professor who made a great comment about genealogies, which in most cases means sort of family histories, and I was talking about queer genealogies, and what he said was, well, it's all really complicated, right? Because genealogy is not just about who you claim, but about who claims you. And I think that is a question I'm constantly struggling with and fighting about and thinking about. Yeah, Rourke, people didn't have the same conceptions of sexuality. One of the things that Chauncey is tracing in this book, which I don't talk about, I'm not going to talk about here, I'll talk about it right now, but we're not going to spend the whole hour on it, is when did the divide between homosexuality and heterosexuality start? And under what circumstances? And did it happen I mean, his argument is that the divide between homo and hetero for working class people came much, much later than it did for middle and upper class people. Middle and upper class people were obsessed with the divide far, far earlier than working class people, particularly working class men. So, that's something to think about as we talk about this. One of the things that he also says that I think is really interesting as well, which addresses one of my favorite things about the way that this changes my paradigms as a historian and as a person who's thinking about the queer past, the queer present, and also queer futurity, is the idea that this sort of double life concept that people used instead of talking about the closet was painful for some people, and some people, we have, right, records that said it was hard, I didn't enjoy living a double life, but other people were like, no, it's super fun. Like, it's fun to present one way to most people and then have a secret code that I can use. They used to call it dropping hairpins. You know, I could, like, drop a little bit of information and be like, or act, you know, in a certain way, or say something, wear a certain piece of clothing that would give me away to other queer people, and they would know, but nobody else would know that about us. And I mean, as a person, right, who I'm constantly bemoaning the fact that straight people keep taking queer ways of dressing from us, and I know people are like, oh, but it just, you know, it breaks down stereotypes. I don't care. You are feel free to disagree with me on these points, right? These are my opinions. But there are ways of coding, right, that make, for me, and I think for other queer folks in the past, make it fun to sort of drop something, or act in a certain way, or that's sort of what flagging is about, right? I have bandanas on either side of my backpack pockets, because, thanks, Rourke, exactly, but I have different colored bandanas in my backpack pockets, and I wear them not because I'm trying to communicate anything about myself sexually per se, but because I know that when people notice that I'm flagging and ask me about it, they're like a person, we share some knowledge in common, and that's really fun. So that's just something to really, like, chew on and think about with regards to, like, the closet and the way that we understand queer people in history and also the present. I want to talk a little bit about coming out, because that is a phrase that you'll encounter earlier in history, in the sort of 20s that Chauncey is writing about. People will write and talk about coming out, but what they mean is not coming out of the closet, right? That's not used until the 1960s. What they mean is coming out to gay life. Literally, it's about being formally presented to the queer community, usually at, like, a drag ball. Oh, Keebling, that's sad. I would have not probably said anything to you, but I would have Snapchatted it and sent it to all of my gay friends. I saw a man once at Wizarding World of Harry Potter in Orlando, Florida, and he was flagging, and I did Snapchat it and sent it to all my gay friends. So yeah, Rourke, it's exactly like a debut. It's like a debutante ball, or or sort of a masquerade ball. There are these social events that are important for the community that bring people together, and that's a place where you say, oh, hello, I am in this community, I belong, I am one of you, and sort of you claim me back is this moment. And that is really, really different, right, from the way that we talk about coming out today. Because I think that the idea, right, of coming out of the closet, and this is one of the things I find most interesting, coming out in the 1920s and 30s is an act that is not, and cannot be actually, in most cases, solitary. It's not something that you do by yourself. There is no real concept of sort of coming out to yourself. It's not about self-recognition. It's about the community that you're joining and becoming a part of. And I think that's really interesting because, I mean, I have a lot of things to say about the romance of community, particularly during Pride Month. There are a lot of folks who are fighting over who counts in the community, who doesn't count, or who the community should recognize, how that recognition should work. Blah, 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 blah. We'll talk about that later. But this idea of coming out as being a hugely social act demands some things, right? It demands you be involved in your community in some respect. It could just be that you show up at the drag balls that happen a couple times a year, or even once a year, and you show up and you're like, hello, I'm here. But that means something, right? It means some level of participation, and not necessarily accountability, but it does mean you're moving in certain ways through public space. It could also, for the record, though, mean you could, and again, this is for gay men, so you could have sex with another man for the first time, and that would be considered sort of a coming out or being brought out into the community. In the 1950s, it moved to be really about your first sexual experience. Yeah, Rourke, flagging is late, because it wasn't always necessary. It's not always part of those codes, so that's really interesting. We can talk about that later. And in the 1970s, right, so really in the wake of, like, certain kinds of activism, it became about coming out to straight people in the way that we understand it today, including straight people into the sort of community of knowledge that you're talking about. But that's not until the 1970s. That's so late. My mother was already born. And she's not that old. So that is something I think that is really interesting to think about, is it wasn't like that. It wasn't like the way it is today. So really, what Chauncey writes in this book is that the closet, as we understand it, is actually a product of a police crackdown that starts in the 30s and continues into the 40s and escalates in the 40s and 50s on sort of cruising or being out in public looking for sex with another person, specifically sex between two men, or they would sort of crack down on gay locales. So if there were certain cafeterias, which always happened or often happened, where a bunch of gay people would sort of get together and maybe like be really gay around each other, and it got to a disturbance, like a level of disturbance that the cops would get involved. Those sort of crackdowns happened more and more and more frequently at the end of the 30s going to the 40s and the 50s. The numbers just escalate. It was like hundreds in the 20s and 30s, and it moved into the thousands in the 40s and 50s. So those gay spaces where people would sort of congregate or look for sex or whatever became less and less publicly allowed. So literally what Chauncey is talking about in his book is that rather than the sort of progressive narrative I talked about, gay culture was extremely visible in the 20s and 30s, and then is hit with this sort of crackdown that drives it underground. It still exists, right? Chauncey's not making the claim that it disappeared by any means. It just took on a different form, and the way that the public understood and accepted and dealt with it changed radically. And then we sort of come out in a different form. Nice. The community takes a different shape, and its relationship to the public takes a different shape after that. So, that's just so interesting to me to think about. But on the other hand, right, these things are different for everyone. They're different. It's not clear if this is the same for queer women, right, because women working in public spaces, women moving through public spaces are radically different than the way that men work through public spaces. I mean, women have always been in public, working class women especially, but it's not clear the ways that, like, working class dykes were negotiating these spaces or how they were making claims or whatever. It's not clear, based on the evidence that Chauncey presents in here. We'll talk about some of that later, I think, maybe. Because Lord only knows I have a lot of things to say about lesbians, both historical and present. But it's not clear. And then, yeah, Boston marriages work, exactly. The other thing to consider is that it's not applied. I mean, if you think about the closet today, right? The closet, as we understand it today, does not apply across everyone, right? So, like, I'm a person who was pretty visibly queer at a pretty young age. You know, when I was in high school, the first time I lived away from home, I had a lot of people asking my friends, like, is I a lesbian? I didn't go by I then, but they did ask if I was a lesbian all the time. And so, you know, for the folks who cannot or do not, for whatever personal reasons, act in gender-specific ways that are also coded as sort of non-heterosexual ways, there is no closet. And so you get situations, right, where, I mean, Chauncey writes a lot about what he terms fairy men, who are extremely effeminate men who are walking, you know, going through the world in extremely effeminate ways that are not doing or are refusing this kind of wearing a mask or living two lives moment. They are just always who they are. They are always effeminate men. They are not interested in sort of coding things differently or in wearing masks. And hi, Sunarel. And I think that is something also to consider, right? That didn't happen equally across everybody. There were individuals in queer history. So, oh, you're not here, Sunrail. Shh. Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming. So, it's not clear. And it also depends specifically on location. And I don't mean just cities. Although there is a lot to say about the way that queer history, I mean, people continue to say this, and I feel like we've gotten some scholarship. I don't know if people who still say this are just whining or if whatever. I love those emojis, Sunarel, who's not there. Cute as hell. What am I saying? Sorry, I have to completely off track because the chat is just so exciting to me. Location. So one of the problems of this book, right, is that it's extremely urban in its setting. And there are endlessly, even today, right, people are like, rural queers existed, they still exist, we need to talk about them. We will talk about rural queers at some point. Yay, Mike, I'm glad the doctor went well. Or I hope it went well, and that you got what you needed from that appointment. So rural queer stuff absolutely applies. The living double lives, wearing of masks, and the closet, some of that may not, right, may not have existed and may have been operating under another procedure, right? I just finished a book the other week about two rural lesbians. The author uses lesbian in the early American Republic. So, like, one of them dies in 1850. And, right, her argument is doesn't really engage in that, but that they were accepted by their communities because they served them and they couldn't hide. And that's another motive being, right? So site-specific meaning urban versus rural, meaning New York versus Chicago versus Minneapolis versus San Francisco versus LA versus Miami. All of these things have very specific cultures. But within those cities, right, there are also very specific sites. The cafeteria versus the park versus baths, gay baths, which don't exist anymore because AIDS happened and we closed all of them down. But I want to read this little section about baths because it's really interesting to me to think about. So Chauncey in this chapter is talking about the social world of baths. Baths being sort of public bathing areas that also become extremely popular for sites of cruising and sex. And they will exist. I don't know that there is a single bath that is still open that I can think about. I think literally they closed them all down during the AIDS crisis. I could be wrong. There might be some in like San Francisco that I don't know about. But that is a thing. But so Chauncey has been talking about the way that relationships were formed in baths, what the world looked like inside of there, and he says, the sharp division of the men who only go to baths for sex between their gay lives at the baths and the straight lives outside was not typical for gay men, but in one respect it may be regarded as prototypical. For if the limits they imposed on their involvement in the gay world were more extreme than those most men imposed, their experiences nonetheless exemplified the extent to which men could participate in gay life and identify themselves with it, even as they hid any traces of that participation from their everyday associates. If the baths served as a kind of closet, in quotation marks for these men, protecting them from the knowledge and hostility of outsiders, it was a very large closet indeed, filled with other people, with doors the police occasionally pried open, but which, more often, they themselves opened and closed at strategic moments. In such closets, a gay world was built. So, right, even these spaces within, if we are going to apply the closet historically backwards to these men that are only going to the baths, and the baths are their gay world, it's not isolation, it's not solitary, it's a community moment. And it's public, and it's just this like really beautiful place that queer, I'm failing to articulate myself particularly well, but what I am trying to say, right, is even places that we could conceive of historically at this time as sort of being closeted or separated from a straight world are still ones of community, sites of community. And I think that is really interesting to me to think about as a queer person, because we speak so much of the isolation of the closet. And one of the biggest takeaways for me about this, that is like why I'm so excited about the closet. Bye, Rourke, thanks for hanging. I really appreciate you coming out. But one of the things that I find so exciting about the closet as this historical construction is that it did not always exist. And my mind is blown by that, right? If we think about how omnipresent the closet is in queer life, it's wild. It's like, can you imagine if your coming out story, for those of us that are queer and or trans in the chat, if your coming out story was like, yeah, I looked fucking awesome when I was presented to my community at a ball, my story would be so much better. My story now sucks ass because, the story that I tell, particularly to straight people, to straight cis folks, is one that is rooted in legibility and That's why it sounds like so many other people's coming out stories. That's why all coming out stories fucking sound the same. Because I'm working within a specific genre. But if my coming out story was like, here's what I wore to my first ball. It was a beautiful rainbow tuxedo, and I looked amazing, and here's who I danced with, that's radically different. And it also, right, like conceiving of a past for me where the closet doesn't exist means that I'm then forced to think about, to imagine this world where things are different. And I think that's one thing that I'm always interested in, particularly because, right, the way that things are currently is not great. We can say, right, well, it's getting better, right? We're kind of on a progressive narrative, or maybe we're moving back towards the way things were in the 20s and 30s, if that's how you want to understand that narrative. But for me, conceiving of other ways of being means that my queer organizing or queer family building does not have to be built around specific rites of passage or specific people. It means that you don't have to come out in certain ways, or the closet doesn't have to exist. It exists now. I'm not going to argue that it's not a hugely important cultural construct that is dictating the way that we live our lives, because it absolutely is. I don't want to deny the reality of the closet. And yeah, and Erin, you're right. There are maybe ways in which my coming out would have been horrible, but I think it would have maybe been less stressful, or it just would be different. And I think that the difference and the different possibilities that a world without the closet opens up for me have been transformative for me, because it allows me to say, it doesn't have to be like this. This world that we live in, there are other ways of being. And that is just like so cool for me to think about, and it lets me think about, well, what are other things that could be different? What are other things about this world that I'm living in that make it difficult that I could change, or could even just start to imagine as being different? So that is my big old chat about the closet. And I'll open it up for questions from folks if you have any about the way that Chauncey talks about queer cultures in New York. Any other stuff you're interested in getting into? Or we could just sit quietly. All of those things work. This question time is always awkward because I feel weird sitting in front of a camera, particularly for the VOD, and not saying anything. But it's just so cool to me. It's like my favorite thing in the world, because I think the closet is so central to the way that we understand queer experience, and the fact that it doesn't have to be is so cool to me. Ugh. Yeah, no, it's not fair. Thank you, Keefling, for hanging out. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you could stick around for me to ramble about all of this. God. Sorry, I'm still thinking about the closet and how good it is. Oh, sorry, Sunarel. Basically, the closet doesn't exist, and coming out used to just be coming out into, like a debutante coming out. So, the closet wasn't used by gay people as a term before the 1960s. That's my easy sum up of the 45 minutes of me talking. Why were the upper class and middle class super concerned about the homo-hetero divide? So the way that I understand what Chauncey is saying is there's a crisis of masculinity that happens when the middle class starts to exist. And particularly, you can also frame it as around being when Frederick Jackson Turner declares and it's fake, the frontier closed. And the frontier, right, this sort of wild space that has to be tamed, had defined American masculinity for a very long time. You know, and the sort of the ways that, like, what that evokes for American masculinity is sort of ways of performing masculinity, the kinds of roles of protection that men are playing, and the sort of tamers. And what happens, particularly with the creation of the middle class and the removal of the middle class from jobs that allow them to sort of perform certain kinds of masculinity or to look certain ways, particularly the middle class fucking panicked because masculinity is different and they aren't the bosses, right? So they don't have that kind of power. They don't have that kind of monetary power to back them up in their positions as men, and nor do they look like sort of working class men that working class men looked like, right? They don't have the sort of physical forms or are participating in kinds of physical works. So the way that they perform masculinity is completely different and isn't recognized by culture. And so one of the reasons they're really afraid, ultimately, of the sort of femininity of middle class masculinity, as weird as that maybe Catch-22 sounds. And so they're very invested in cataloging ways of behavior because it's ways of policing and asserting a new form of masculinity. So they can say, well, we have money, we're not the bosses, we're richer and have more power than working class folks, but the masculinity looks different, but also we're not homosexuals. And so it's a new way of splitting, right, the ways that masculinity worked. So I don't know if that fully answers your question or if it got very confusing in the middle, but that is one theory, right, of addressing how homosexuality became to be such this sort of critical juncture, is it has everything to do with the ways that manhood gets transformed. Yeah, no problem. And if you have any other questions or other things you want to, even if it's not stuff about the time period, I'm hoping to go back and talk more about it, but I'm always happy to talk about queer history of any kind. So, and if not, we can totally skedaddle. Yeah, there are so many. If you look at my annotations for this book, it's super interesting because he does a pretty good job, particularly with the class analysis. It's really nuanced, which is rare. Sunarel, I have been bouncing around, so I have been normally doing these streams on Saturdays from 4 to 5. I did Thursday this week, because I'm gone this Saturday, and I have no idea what's happening next week. I guess I could have announced that too. Next week is really weird because you all know that I'm having top surgery on Tuesday. I have no idea what recovery is going to look like. I guess I could talk about it next Saturday. I don't know if I will be well enough on Thursday to pull this off, but if you want to let me know if this time works better for you than Saturday, that's totally cool. I try to pick mid to late afternoon because I think it's before a lot of folks who are streaming games at night, and but it's also like not so early that people maybe are still at work. So that is the longest answer to your question. Ooh, UK queer history. No is the short answer. I'm really US focused in my work. There might be some interesting things in Erin about, like, Victim, the movie, which I'm sure you've heard about, and maybe you've seen it. I've seen it. There are some things about, I've read some trans stuff. Stephen Whittle is a trans, he's actually a legal scholar, I think, but most of what I've seen is rooted in the US context, and I will, but I can look for you. So yeah, I would start with, I think Victim came out in 1960 maybe, and was in reference to a sort of decriminalization. But I'm not 100% sure about that. And Stephen Whittle, I will see if I can get some UK specific stuff that he writes about. I know there is some of it because I think it's in transgender. What is that book called? Transgender Rights. But I know he's from the UK, so I will look that up for you, and I'll get that information to you as soon as I can. And Mike, US books, Gay New York is pretty accessible. You can almost definitely get it through the Chicago Public Library. I mean, it depends on what you want to talk about, right? Because there are, yeah, actually, Mike, that's not a bad idea. I have a whole queer history shelf on Goodreads that you might want to parse through. I can think of sort of better accessible stuff. Trying to think if there's anything else that's really spoke to me, that's really changed. I mean, Gay New York was my first sort of book that did this. Oh, actually, Transgender History by Susan Stryker. It's in its second edition. I haven't read the second edition. I have the first one. But she does a really good job. She is brilliant. The way that she explains Judith Butler makes me feel like I don't have to read Judith Butler. And that should be accessible to you. The problem is that I hide all my queer history books back behind this flag. So I don't know. Oh, and Aaron, any stuff about Oscar Wilde probably also helps. I don't study England. I have a buddy who studies aesthetics in the British Empire who writes and teaches about Oscar Wilde, and so stuff about that is probably maybe relevant. Let me see. Yeah, I haven't done as much reading as I pretend to, is the real secret. So, I also, yeah. There is a book called, oh fuck, what's it called? Oh, god damn it. Oh, Just Queer Folks by Colin Robinson is about rural queers, and I will probably end up talking about that at some point. But that's another good, it's his history book, Mike, about the US. So, but yeah, my Goodreads profile is probably the best place to look for book recs. So yeah, Cinderella, it's really hard not knowing how to read and learning queer history. So yeah, so I think I'm gonna wrap it up, y'all, unless you do have more questions. Just so you are all free to go about your days, and I can change out of my clothes and open this window because it's hot in my room again. But thank you so much for coming to sit. Oh, Mike, Sue, your internet connection. Homophobic. It's Pride Month. Yes, thank you for coming and just listening to me blather on about this stuff. It's really fun for me to do, and I hope that you all learn something, or it's fun for you. And I will let everyone know on Twitter what is up regarding next week. I would say if I'm gonna do it, it will be Saturday. So thanks so much, guys. Have a good one, and hit me up on Twitter or otherwise. Thank you. Bye.